So Russia has basically lost out again, with Donald Trump pulling off an effective diplomatic coup, or at least that's what some people are calling it. Armenia and Azerbaijan, sworn rivals for a long time and deep, complex history, have signed a historic US brokered peace deal in the White House. Now, if it holds, it would unquestionably transform the South Caucasus and, in many eyes, redraw the maps from as far from Central Asia to Europe, geopolitically, strategically, geoeconomically, and that's because at the center of it is a brand new, highly strategic trade corridor being rebranded as, wait for it, the Trump route for international peace and prosperity, or as I'm going to be calling it by its acronym, TRIP. Now, this will change the region, as I say, geopolitically, economically, but even potentially ideologically. And therefore, it's far more than simply a handshake, a photo op, or about Trump himself. And in this video, therefore, I wanted to understand what this means for, well, some of the biggest winners or losers, but also how it could be a key component in, well, the Trump-Putin meeting and the future of Ukraine, because there's so much more here. And even if it's a small area, well, we can see how sometimes small regions can have big impacts geopolitically.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the Global Gambit, where if you're a regular viewer, you'll know that this is sometimes a traveling podcast, or some of you might think it's a bit of a traveling circus, given the problems I've been having with Wi-Fi. But this time we are coming to you from Corfu, Greece, and focusing on Armenia and Azerbaijan, which have, as I said, a very complicated and unfortunately tragic history, particularly over border disputes, territorial claims, and specifically one, Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, when those two countries gained independence in 1991, there was the first war that erupted soon after the Soviet Union collapsed, killing tens of thousands and displacing hundreds of thousands more. Now, for much of the time since then, in the mid-90s to sort of late 90s, Armenia held most of the cards in terms of control because of, well, a disproportionate amount of support from Moscow, though Russia did try to keep both Azerbaijan and Armenia on good terms. However, as those late 90s became thousands and the 2010s, the balance of power greatly pivoted towards Azerbaijan, with it growing significantly in the eyes of some, even the European Research and Development Bank suggesting it was the fastest growing economy or petrostate economy up until around 2014 because of the resources it had in the Caspian Sea and its ability to gain a lot of income and revenue from them. But also because of the role that Turkey had, particularly as Erdogan took over Turkey in the mid-2000s, significantly deepened ties and support with the former Azerbaijani president, Heydar Aliyev, often describing the two as being a one nation, two states because of the ideological overlap. Indeed, Turkey was one of the first countries to recognize Azerbaijan's independence in 1918 and the first to recognize its restoration in 1991. Now, let's fast forward to and in 2020, Azerbaijan, with Turkish backing and advanced drone capabilities, took back large swathes of disputed territory with tens of thousands of casualties, again, it being focused largely on Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, although these skirmishes were eventually subdued, with Russia leading those peace efforts, it never was fully resolved. And interestingly, though, this was probably the last time we saw any real influence from the Russians in the South Caucasus. Then, in 2023, Azerbaijan launched a lightning offensive that basically dismantled the Armenian-backed Artsakh Republic and sending over 100,000 ethnic Armenians fleeing within days. That defeat left Armenia essentially questioning its alliance with Russia. Moscow, despite being the supposed security guarantor of the region and the regional hegemon, had failed to intervene, even after Armenia had activated twice its protection of, well, through what's known as the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or Russia's subsequent replacement of the Warsaw Pact and response to NATO. But it never came to their aid. And so Armenia began seeking alternative partners and even started exploring cautiously reconciliation with Turkey, such as a historic Armenian leadership to visit Ankara in 2024. Now that brings us to August 2025. An Armenian Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, and Azerbaijan President Ilham Aliyev signed this joint declaration in Washington. The centerpiece, the TRIP corridor, linking Azerbaijan to its exclave, Nakhchivan, through Armenia's Shunuk province. Now, there's quite a lot in this document, but the key points are these. Legal status. Crucially for Armenia, which has had a lot of concerns around sort of an effective pincer movement between Turkey and Azerbaijan being squeezed, it remains under its jurisdiction. However, interestingly, the control of the land, so to speak, has been leased to a private US company for development and management of, say, things like rail lines, telecommunications infrastructure, and oil and gas pipelines. And the purpose of this is to, quote, provide unimpeded connectivity between Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan, whilst respecting Armenia's sovereignty. But it's important to stress the peace agreement held at the White House is in reality a non-binding declaration. So it's more of an effective memorandum of understanding, an MOU, than a final settlement. The provisions are vague, with binding enforcement mechanisms not existing, and much of what was announced repackaging ideas that Armenia and Azerbaijan had already agreed to in principle ages ago. The real obstacle in this case is Azerbaijan's demand for Armenia to basically amend its constitution to unequivocally recognize Baku's sovereignty over Nagorno-Karabakh, which, well, is the sticking point between these two countries, and the fact that Armenia hasn't done so means that it's not going to be resolved anytime soon either. The trip corridor is not yet a done deal. Both sides have only expressed the determination to walk towards it with no firm timeline, so it's a commitment. And others have noted that some of the motivation here was to give Trump that starring role. I mean, it's got the acronym, his bloody name in it. So with his name literally on the project, his personal brand and political skin is now tied to this success. So it's more than just merely a bilateral transport link, and it's designed in some people's eyes to try and revive the ancient Silk Road that went through there, most crucially, bypassing Russia and Iran, the two more regionally considered dominant powers. Now, before we continue, I'm very curious to know what you think about this. So do let me know in the comments below, and also, well, whether you like changing backgrounds. So why does this matter then? Well, particularly for Russia and Iran, who have spent decades bottling up Central Asia's westward trade routes, this is a huge problem because the corridor changes that equation, allowing economies from Turkmenistan to Kyrgyzstan to connect directly to global markets and not have to seek permission or go through Moscow or Tehran. Now, in some ways, you could argue that the US has also basically become the new security guarantor of the South Caucasus, upending decades of traditional power dynamics. From Armenia, too, it comes, though, with a particular bit of geopolitical risk, because it does appear to be physically reconnecting to the Turkic world in a way that it hasn't done so for so long. But Yerevan's logic is strategic. Since Moscow has failed to come to their aid, well, multiple times, and even proposed its own Zangezur corridors that never were materialized, well, they're inviting the US to be that oversight. So they get a new security guarantor, one with the capacity to keep Turkey and its influence in check and punish Moscow for its perceived betrayal. Also, for Trump again himself, some people argue this could be a bargaining chip. In addition, the attempted peacemaking here could be argued is still one of various elements. In theory, this could be used as a bargaining chip with Russia. Participation in TRIP could be offered or withheld, depending on Putin's behavior in Ukraine peace talks. It could also be a tool to pressure Iran, if you think about it, as Azerbaijan's economic rise could inspire some potential separatist sentiments, which does exist in small pockets, to grow in Iran's Azerbaijani province. And indeed, in the past few years, as Azerbaijan has gotten stronger with that support from Turkey, it has been more vocal about historical territorial claims it has to parts of Iran. And then thirdly, think about this from the Trump administration's interests. It could be a broader sort of geostrategic counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative, as by offering China an alternative to Chinese finance routes through Iran, the US undercuts Beijing's influence and builds on probably arguably Trump's main foreign policy objective, which is to take on China directly. Both sides, though, have said that this is a, direct blow to their influence, some in Tehran even calling TRIP a, quote, political plot and a mortal threat to Iranian security, and they will, by all means, try to block it. Now, Russia and Iran are relative losers, but arguably the biggest overall or absolute loser is Georgia. Georgia currently profits from key transit routes, including the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline. TRIP could make these basically redundant, stripping Georgia of its effective role as a regional energy hub. For example, former Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili has warned that this could leave the country in, quote, complete geopolitical isolation alongside Iran and Russia, which would trigger emigration and systemic economic decline. But on the other side, it could potentially weaken the Russian-backed leadership and sort of pockets of influence that exist there and have been trying to centralize power and undermine Georgia's democracy, as we've seen through the various protests against some of the bills being pushed through. On that point, Russia has said that this is an agreement that, well, undermines. Concerning Russian influence, again, Russia has been quick to push back, insisting that any reconciliation must be situated within the quote-unquote regional context, i.e. the status quo which benefits Moscow, and claims that its trilateral agreements that it brokered between Armenia and Azerbaijan from 2020 are the baseline. They remain the most valid, and therefore neither side has formally withdrawn from those agreements, and so Russia's involvement in that regional connectivity is non-negotiable. She has also hinted that heavier US involvement will heighten volatility, saying that the sad experience of Western assistance in resolving conflicts in the Middle East could come to the Caucasus. Interestingly enough, Iran's reaction has been sort of a mixture. In some ways, it's been cautiously approving of the peace deal, but the biggest critique, as I mentioned just now, is about US involvement, with Al-Khamenei, the supreme leader, calling it, well, effectively like having a viper lying between Iran and Russia, and threatening it could turn it into a graveyard of mercenaries for Donald Trump. The biggest winner, absolute, of all of this is Turkey. Now, I've alluded to them throughout the video, but they gain new transport links eastward through Armenia-Azerbaijan. And, well, with Russia effectively withdrawing or unable to command such immediate influence at the same time, spreading itself so thinly across Africa and in Ukraine, well, we saw what happened with Syria, right? They didn't do anything. Turkey is taking up that mantle, and they are physically directly there. And it's quite interesting how this could play out also vis-a-vis the EU. The EU has strongly endorsed the deal, and they've called it a major development and pledged to invest in regional connectivity. But they do face a balancing act, because on the one side, they have been supporting the democratization of Armenia and wanting to provide it economic security and support, but also they don't want to do so too much that it might antagonize Ankara, Turkey, because Turkey sees this now as their backyard. And, well, we know the delicate relationship of Turkey to the EU with migration flows, but also NATO and the indispensable role Turkey has over, well, this sort of crossing of Europe into Asia, or however you'd like to frame it. Armenia's position, therefore, has to try and frame TRIP as an opportunity rather than a threat. Pashinyan even arguing that it could be an opportunity for deeper cooperation between groups like even the Iranians and the Americans or the Russians, though I still find that pretty unlikely. Domestic opposition is strong. Polling suggests only around a third of Armenians believe the country is headed in the right direction. And obviously, with any economic project or sort of shift of this size, security is incredibly important. Speaking of security, this makes it a high-value target now, and some people comparing this new deal to Panama, the Suez Canals, both requiring decades of military protection. Ensuring that security might therefore require the US to, well, deploy foreign troops, which would go against Trump's America First policy. And also, as I said before, it doesn't resolve the displaced population of Nagorno-Karabakh. It doesn't address Armenian prisoners of war, safeguarding Armenian cultural heritage in conflict zones. And of course, something of this scale without proper security means it's ripe for sabotage, for people to hit it, particularly non-state actors or individual groups with a particular grudge, separatist groups that see this as an opportunity to exploit a fragile and seemingly unsecured new situation. Either way, TRIP could reshape the South Caucasus more than arguably any other project since the Soviet Union collapsed. It promises, in theory, economic integration between Armenia and Azerbaijan, reduced Russian and Iranian leverage, which, well, for some people will be a welcomed thing, and even this idea of a revived Silk Road, which would compete or more effectively, or hopes, at least for the Trump administration, undermine China's overarching influence all the way westwards with the BRI. But obviously with opportunities comes new risks, and specifically in this case, geopolitical flashpoints. Many, it's a PR stunt. Trump, he's going to feel triumph for, but most importantly, for the two countries most affected in, well, actually a about what this is about, Armenia and Azerbaijan, it's seemingly a bet on Western aligned protection over what would have been Russian. And again, illustration of how small regions, which can often be forgotten about, can still have pivotal roles in the bigger chess game of geopolitics. Now, I'm curious again what you think about this. Is it a big deal or just a component of a bigger tug of war between powers and just something that, well, is inevitable in geopolitical chess games? Let me know in the comments below. Do subscribe for more things like this and watch this video down here to understand what could happen in the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska. Take care, everyone.